Okay, and I think we are ready to begin. So, first of all, a warm welcome to everyone who has chosen to come and join us for this fabulous thesis theatre. And I'm very excited about this because this is a wonderful piece of work, and I know you're going to enjoy it just as much as I did when I was working alongside Trevor. So, we are going to be getting started in a second. Just a couple of things. Feel free to use the chat and chat amongst yourselves, no problem. But if you have a question that you would like me to ask Trevor on your behalf, please pop it into the Q&A because it might get lost in the chat. So obviously we would love to have your questions towards the end of this thesis theatre, but please put them in the Q&A so that I don't miss anybody's. Okay, and there's some wonderful messages coming through for you, Trevor, already. Brenton says, good luck. Sharon is doing the rah, rah, rah thing, and I am picturing Sharon with pom-poms right this second. Chris Swank is looking forward to this. Oh, and Tom Hillman's here as well. And Diane says, good luck. Do you know what? Good luck, but you don't need it. It's great. It's absolutely wonderful. Okay, so let's get started straight away then. And I'm going to first of all tell you a little bit about what Trevor has been doing, and then I'm going to give you a little bit of information about Trevor himself, and then Trevor's going to take over and is going to tell you all about his thesis. So the title of this thesis is Tolkien's Vision of Faërie in Smith of Wootton Major. I'm just going to tell you a little bit about Trevor. He is a software engineer with more than 25 years of experience in the industry. He has a background in literature with an MLIS from the University of Texas at Austin and a BA in English from George Mason University. His research interests include world building in speculative fiction, Tolkien, there's a surprise, Frank Herbert, Le Guin, Shakespeare, and the Renaissance. He's presented working papers on The Lord of the Rings, Dune, King Lear, world building, and other topics. He's published an essay, World Building Design Patterns in the Works of J.R.R. Tolkien, in Subcreating Ardor, which was published by Walking Tree Publishers in 2019, and is co-editor of Discovering Dune from Macfarlane Books, published in 2022. He lives in Northern Virginia and, like many of us, enjoys books, jazz, tea, and cats. I need say no more. Okay, so Trevor, let us begin by me asking you, can you please give us an overview of what your thesis is about?
Yeah, thank you very much. Let me go ahead and start the presentation and get into that a little bit. Share the right. All right. So I'm really thankful to have you guys here. I've got some things that I want to share with you, things I've been kind of excited about for a long time, and wove them into my thesis. So before we get started too far, I did want to thank some folks, Dr. Sora Brown, my thesis director, Dr. Berlin Flieger, who was the second reader. And then also I wanted to thank a friend of mine, Mary Dole, for an insight that she gave me at a time that was very, very apropos and kind of tilted me in a direction that I needed to go into at that particular time. So anyways, thank you to those folks. And what we're going to talk about today is we're going to take a look at Tolkien's book, Smith of Wootton Major, written in 1965. And I'm also going to take a look at an essay that he wrote to accompany the story. And these two together really give us a wonderful, beautiful picture of Tolkien's thoughts on faery, something that was very important to him. So where did I get the idea for this thesis? When I discovered that essay that I just mentioned that Tolkien wrote to accompany Smith of Wootton Major, it had really only become available recently, so I don't think a whole lot of folks had a chance to take a look at it and think about it much. But at the very end of that essay, Tolkien says something absolutely amazing. He says, faery is as necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human as is sunlight for physical life. And I was really struck by this. It's kind of an amazing statement to make. And I have been thinking about what Tolkien might have meant by this for maybe 10 or 15 years now, and so it made all kinds of sense to do a thesis on it. So what are the questions that I'm trying to answer? The first one is, what can we know about Tolkien's vision of faery from Smith of Wootton Major and the accompanying essay? And then, like I mentioned in the last slide, what does Tolkien mean when he says that faery is necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human? I use this phrase, vision of faery, and Tolkien spent a lot of time thinking about faery throughout his life. He wrote about it in a very well-known essay on fairy stories in 1937, and he was still thinking about it in 1965 when he wrote Smith of Wootton Major and the essay. These works are much less well-known than On Fairy Stories, which I think is unfortunate because they have a lot to say about what Tolkien thought of faery. So what do I mean by vision of faery? Tolkien speaks of having an imperfect vision of faery in On Fairy Stories, and I propose that he continued to refine his vision throughout his life, and that Smith of Wootton Major and the essay are the last words we have from Tolkien on the subject of faery. I did some research to validate that statement. I did not see anything that he had written that's available to us after Smith and the essay. Now, I'm sure Tolkien being Tolkien, I'm sure he was still thinking about it up to the very end. But unfortunately, we do have some indication of what he was thinking about it towards the end of his life. So, what is faery? Faery has a lot of different definitions. What is it? A frame of mind? Is it a way of life? Is it an altered state of being? Is it a place of enchantment? What is it? And Tolkien being Tolkien, he had a very complex understanding of faery. And I really like this quote by Verlyn Flieger. She says, throughout his writing life, and that was a long one, faery was for Tolkien a word and an idea that embraced many meanings. It was at once a literary construct, an imaginal exercise, a make-believe world, a place to go to, and an altered state of being. A series of ideas easier to picture than to explain, very much like his spelling of the word. So there's a lot of different ways that Tolkien thought about faery, and probably even some on here that we don't know of. So in the story that we're taking a look at in Smith of Wootton Major and the essay, faery is primarily a make-believe world or a literary construct. It's presented as a place to go to, as a place that Smith goes to. But toward the end of the essay, Tolkien shifts to faery as an altered state of being. And that's the last couple of paragraphs where he switches to talk about what faery represents. And we're going to talk a bit more about that towards the end of this presentation, because I think there's something very fascinating and beautiful going on there. So that's some thoughts on what is faery within the context of what we're doing here. Let's talk a little bit about Smith of Wootton Major. It's a standalone novella. It's not connected to his legendarium. It's not connected to this, wide world that he created that includes Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit and the Silmarillion. It stands on its own. It takes place in Wootton Major. It's a village, kind of vaguely medieval, next to faery. And one of the inhabitants, one of the children in Wootton Major, is given a silver star from faery, and that enchanted star enables him to explore faery mostly safely. And the story of Smith of Wootton Major is his experiences in faery. It's not really much of a plot. It's not a plot-driven story. It's really about his experiences. It's about taking in those experiences and experiencing them ourselves as well. And then at the end of the story, he has to pass on the star to somebody else and return to ordinary life. So it does have a bittersweet ending. I'd like to talk a little bit about those experiences that he goes through. Faery is kind of a complicated place. There's a lot going on there. Smith encounters, in the Sea of Windless Storms, Smith encounters some elven warriors who are returning from battle. And Tolkien writes that they were tall and terrible. Their swords shone and their spirits glinted, and a piercing light was in their eyes. They lifted up their voices in a song of triumph, and his heart was shaken with fear, and he fell upon his face. So faery contains contains beauty, but it also contains terror. It's not always a tame place. But he does see some beautiful things. Tolkien writes that he saw the king's tree springing up, tower upon tower into the sky, and its light was like the sun at noon, and it bore at once leaves and flowers and fruits uncounted, and not one was the same as any other. Then there's a strange, sad experience. Smith discovers a lake in the outer mountains. There's a great wind that comes up, and to avoid being blown away, Smith grabs onto a young birch tree. The tree loses all its leaves, and he tries to apologize, and he tries to make amends. Its response is, "Go away. The wind is hunting you. You do not belong here. Go away," and never return. So he's rejected, and he does stay away from faery for a while. He's so ashamed of this. He does stay away from faery for a while, but he does eventually return. He encounters, in the Vale of Evermorn, he encounters elvish maids dancing, and he's invited to dance with them for a few minutes. And Tolkien writes, the speed and the grace and the ever-changing modes of their enchantment, of their movement, enchanted him. There they danced together, and for a while he knew what it was to have the swiftness and the power and the joy to accompany her for a while. Then he meets the queen herself. Tolkien writes, she wore no crown and had no throne. She stood there in her majesty and her glory, and all about her was a great host, shimmering and glittering like the stars above. Then he knelt, and she stooped and laid her hand upon his head. And he seemed to be both in the world and in faery, so that he was at once in bereavement and in ownership and in peace. One thing I would like to address is a question of whether Smith of Wooton is an allegory. Now, Smith's journeys in faery are strange, and I think it causes a lot of people to wonder if maybe they're symbolic. I think there's a temptation to try and figure out what these mean, what they represent. And there's a long line of scholars who have attempted to understand this allegorically. And even Tolkien himself, for a very brief period of time, wondered if there was something allegorical about it, but he never really follows that up. And later he states that it was not an allegory. And Tolkien, as we all know, cordially dislike allegory in all of its manifestations, and always have done so since I grew old and wary enough to detect its presence. Now, that's a little bit, there's a case to be made that he did on a couple occasions use allegory, so he might probably did not like it, dislike it entirely, but he, generally speaking, did not work with allegory. And in my opinion, allegorization takes the reader away from what Smith is about and what it's meant to do. Some of the problems with the allegorical approach, it's not immediately and obviously allegorical, so you have to read that in. It's a reductionist approach. It takes a text that's multidimensional and flattens it out, and it reduces it to a puzzle. Why bother further looking at it after you've solved the puzzle? You set it aside, like you might set aside the crossword puzzle when you're done with it and never think about it again. There's no agreed upon equivalences. Each attempt is different, and there's no real support elsewhere for any of these, so they really amount to what you might call private interpretations, which doesn't mean that it's not true. It just really raises the bar. So from my point of view, Smith of Wootton Major is not an allegory, and we're not meant to understand it as such. What is it? Quite simply, it's a fairy story. Dr. Flieger says its purpose is not to make sense, but to give the reader a glimpse of the perilous realm that Tolkien called faery. So the lack of explanation is the point. It's about experiences instead of explanation. Tolkien said on fairy stories, he said, most good fairy stories are about the aventures of men in the perilous realm or upon its shadowy marches. And I can't think of anything he wrote that fits that better than Smith of Wootton Major. Talk a little bit about the essay. Written to accompany Smith, we believe at about the same time as he wrote Smith. He expands on the story. He provides backstory, commentary, and a lot of other really fascinating information. It has not been available widely for until fairly recently. Dr. Flieger published a expanded edition of Smith of Wootton Major that included the essay in 2005, and pieces of the essay had been available in A Question of Time, also by Dr. Flieger, in the middle 90s. So we haven't had a lot of time to look at this and digest this. And one of the things I'd like to accomplish with this thesis is to get people to look at and study this amazing work and add to our understanding of it. The essay is the story from the point of view of faery. If Smith is a fairy story, it's about humans and faery, then the essay is a human story. It's about faery in the human realm. And it tells the story of the village of Wootton Major from the point of view of faery. And what faery is seeing is that the village is in trouble. It was once connected to faery, geographically and spiritually. And that connection led to prosperity, to high craftsmanship and creativity. And one of the things you see in the story is this the master cook, who's responsible for cooking for various official feasts and so forth, was very important, was highly respected. So there's was still some of this connection to faery, but it was quickly dwindling. The town was becoming comfortable and self-satisfied, vulgarly self-satisfied, and coarser. And maybe most importantly, they had become skeptical about faery and history and legend. So they're losing their grip on faery. They're drifting away from faery and losing a lot of valuable things and replacing them with a concern with profit and control and possession and so forth. So faery has a response. One of the things that's important to note about Tolkien's faery and the elves is that for the most part they are beneficent. They are beneficial or have a positive attitude towards humanity. Faery is beneficent, but it's not obligated to help. Faery is concerned about this decline away from faery. Faery understands that love of faery is essential to the full and proper human development. And the powers in faery have an ultimate kinship with men and have a permanent love for them in general. So there's this very powerful connection between faery and humanity, and it causes faery to want to do something about that connection being becoming undone, declining. So they develop a missionary plan, that's Tolkien's phrase, to reverse the decline of the influence of faery. The missionary plan has two parts. One is both of them are related to maintaining the relationship between faery and the human realm. Wootton Major still values good cooking. The master cook is still an important figure. So the king of faery is going to become a kitchen servant in Wootton Major, and eventually, as an apprentice, eventually he will become the master cook. And the intent is to establish a tradition of a long reign of light, color, and mirth, as well as culinary excellence together, with the rumor that this was due to a beneficent intrusion from faery. So they want to sort of re-inject faery into the thinking of the people in the village and make them associate all these good, positive things with faery. And then the other part of the missionary plan of faery is to allow a few humans, like Smith, to visit faery and to learn about it deeply, to pass on knowledge via lore and companionship. Towards that end, they create a silver star that will allow visitors to pass safely in faery. That silver star is hidden in a great cake. There's a feast every 24 years where 24 good children are invited to eat an enormous cake. And the master cook at that point is the king of faery. He hides a silver star in the great cake, and Smith is the child who swallows the star and gains passage into faery. So as you can see, we're looking at the other side of the story of Smith the Wootton Major. So let's actually talk about this vision of faery that I've been kind of mentioning from the beginning. One of the most important things about faery is that Tolkien believed that it was necessary, absolutely necessary. And of course, this is a third time I've presented this, but I want to kind of bring us around to it. Faery is as necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human as is sunlight for physical life. So faery is absolutely necessary. Let's back up a little bit to 1937 in the essay on fairy stories, because as I pointed out earlier, that vision of faery, he mentions it, he starts talking about it in On Fairy Stories. And in On Fairy Stories, he talks about some of the things that faery provides as fantasy and fairy stories. And I'm only going to touch on these real briefly. He goes into quite a lot of detail about these. It's well worth looking at. Recovery, regaining of a clear view, escape into secondary worlds, consolation, satisfaction of desires, and then eucatastrophe, which is the happy ending, the sudden joyous turn when things look like they're at their worst, and then they turn and head towards the positive ending. So I'm only going to mention these because I do want to make sure that they get included into our understanding of the vision of faery. So enchantment is very much tied into Tolkien's vision of faery. There's a quote that I really like on fairy stories. Tolkien writes, "Faery contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarfs, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it, tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted." So when we are enchanted, we are in faery. What is enchantment? This is a huge topic. I really only go into a little bit in the thesis. I like this definition by Patrick Curry. Patrick Curry has done a lot of thinking about enchantment and Tolkien and the relationship between the two. And he writes that the heart of enchantment is an experience of wonder. It varies in intensity from charm through delight to full-blown joy. The last distinguishes radical or deep enchantment, which is rare but life-changing. And then I really like Tolkien's definition of enchantment. It's a reversal of a slide towards dullness, self-satisfaction, and the overwhelming focus on profit, control, and possession. It's an openness to wonders and marvels, to journeys in faery. And he writes in On Fairy Stories that enchantment does not seek delusion nor bewitchment and domination. It seeks shared enrichment, partners in making and delight, not slaves. And I love that phrase, shared enrichment, partners in making and delight. So what I'd like to do in these last 3 or 4 slides is to take a look at that final paragraph in the essay that accompanies Smith of Wootton Major. I'd like to, there's so much more that could be said about this, and I get a start on it in my thesis, but I'd like to at least bring to your attention what Tolkien wrote about what faery represents in the last paragraph of the essay that accompanies Smith of Wootton Major. Faery represents at its weakest a breaking out, at least in mind, from the iron ring of the familiar, still more from the adamantine ring of belief that it is known, possessed, controlled, and so ultimately all that is worth being considered, a constant awareness of a world beyond these rings. So he's referring to an awareness of the world beyond. Faery takes us beyond what we're familiar, beyond everything that's all about possession and control and knowledge, and power knowledge. It takes us beyond those into a realm where we're beyond that, constant awareness of a world beyond these rings of the familiar and the belief that is known, possessed, and controlled. Faery includes both ruth and delight. Tolkien writes, more strongly, faery represents love, that is, a love and respect for all things, inanimate and animate, an unpossessive love of them as other. This love will produce both ruth and delight. And this word ruth here is not used this way very often now, but it simply means compassion. You've maybe heard of somebody being ruthless. without compassion. Ruth means compassion. So faery includes both ruth and delight. Faery is transformative. Things seen in its light will be respected, and they will also appear delightful, beautiful, wonderful, even glorious. Faery is very, very much connected to imagination. This is a huge topic of Tolkien, and imagination is a huge topic that here again I was just able to get a start on in my thesis. Faery might be said indeed to represent imagination without definition, because taking in all the definitions of this word: aesthetic, exploratory and receptive, and artistic, inventive, dynamic, subcreative. Faery requires a response. Tolkien writes, this compound of awareness of a limitless world outside our domestic parish, a love in ruth and admiration for the things in it, and a desire for wonder, marvels, both perceived and conceived, this faery is as necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human as is sunlight for physical life, sunlight as distinguished from the soil, saith though it in fact permeates and modifies even that. So it requires openness. It requires a response from us, an openness to the limitless world beyond the familiar, an openness to love the things that are in it with compassion and delight, and an openness to participating in wonder and marvels, both perceived and conceived. So we've just gotten started talking about Tolkien's vision of faery. So a couple of ways that I think we can maybe start to think about faery based on all of this. And this first one here, of course, is a paraphrase of Tolkien, what Tolkien has said. Faery is what happens when we step out of the familiar and open ourselves to wonder and marvels and to loving and delighting in what we find there. Faery is the creative life. It's curiosity, imagination, openness, compassion, delight, respect. And then to summarize, Tolkien had a very high view of faery. For him, it meant more than just a place where fairies live or the setting of fairy stories, but rather that realm, sometimes separate from our world, sometimes coterminous, where wonder, awe, delight, ruth, beauty, even glory are found. It not only merely is, but also can affect us powerfully, producing an altered state of being characterized by compassion, delight, respect, imagination, and creativity. So I would like to, before I close up here, I would like to, there's a number of implications that follow from this vision of faery. And I would like to bring up one of them because I think it probably applies more so to the folks who are listening to this. And that is that the creative person, the writer, the poet, the artist, these are not optional members of society. Their work, which is partaking of faery and sourced from it, is just as important as that of any other member of society. If faery is necessary for human functioning, then those who bring forth faery are necessary as well. They point us out of the dull and the familiar and towards enchantment. So there's a whole bunch of other things that I would like to have gotten to in my thesis, but just kind of beyond the word count and what I had energy for at the time. But there's a lot of implications and a lot of thoughts related to this that at some point I hope to explore further. So anyways, thank you very much. I welcome your questions and comments. Are you going to lead those, Dr. Brown, or?
I am ready and happy to. But
Okay.
before you stop sharing, Sparrow would love it if you would go back to slide 32, the quotation by Clark. She didn't take a screenshot quickly enough.
Oh, okay.
She would like to see it again.
Is this the, well, hold on a second.
32. Oh, 31 to 33. How bizarre.
I did skip a slide in there. Is this the from Curry? She said Clark,
the quotation by Clark.
I don't have anything with Clark.
Did you mean Curry, Sparrow? I tell you what, would you be happy to share your share your slideshow with curry.
Oh,
Sparrow is saying it is in fact
oh,
curry.
okay.
So it
Yeah,
must be this. It
that's a
must be
quote
this
then.
on slide 30.
Yeah.
Okay. Have you got it, Sparrow? Okay. Brenton says Sparrow is so awesome she can see slide 32 even when it doesn't exist.
Sparrow's awesome.
Yes. Yes, she is. Yeah, she's got it. Okay, and you can
Fantastic.
stop sharing now then, Trevor. Thank you.
Okay.
Okay. Right. So, well, that was fabulous. Absolutely wonderful. And there's much joy and celebration going on in the chat for that. Okay, so I'm looking in the Q&A and we do actually have some questions coming in. So before we get to some of the questions I want to ask you, because we've just come out of your presentation, this question really does fit with that. Question from Tom Hillman. And he says, near the beginning of On Fairy Stories, Tolkien famously says, fairy contains many things besides elves and fays, and besides dwarves, witches, trolls, giants, or dragons. It holds the seas, the sun, the moon, the sky, and the earth, and all things that are in it. Tree and bird, water and stone, wine and bread, and ourselves, mortal men, when we are enchanted. And he wants to know, how do you think that fits, if at all, with the birch tree's declaration that mortal men do not belong in faery? Do they reflect the same point of view? Or do they suggest that his view has evolved because we fallen mortal men cause harm to faery because we try to dominate and possess everything?
That's a good question. In order for mortal men to be in faery, we need to be in an enchanted state. I don't think we belong naturally in faery. We can visit it with the proper protection, but we do not really belong there. Now, having said that, I think what you're talking about here, about Tolkien's view having evolved, Tolkien's thinking was always evolving. So I think it's entirely correct to say that he might have thought differently when he was writing Smith, Wootton Major and the essay that goes with it. And yes, we have this mindset of domination and possession, and that I think is not something that's really part of faery. It's not something that faery wants there all the time. So, good question.
Okay, thanks for that question, Tom. Now I can see there are other questions in the Q&A, and I will come to them, I promise. But first of all, Trevor, if I could just sort of rewind and ask you just to quickly explain how and why you chose your topic.
It's quite a while ago. I think like I said at the beginning, Smith and Wootton Major and the essay has been something that's really fascinated me for a long time, and I think it's fascinated me in large part because we're getting a view of almost like a pure view of Tolkien's thoughts and vision of faery. In other words, Smith and Wootton Major, all the other works that he's done, faery and enchantment are fairly small parts of that. But here in Smith and Wootton Major, we're getting Tolkien sitting down towards the end of his life and giving us his thoughts on faery, and I found that fascinating. And I think that the question that I ask, what can we find out about faery from Smith and Wootton Major and the essay, kind of comes out of that fascination with Smith in the essay.
Mm-hmm. Okay, thank you. So you brought up that accompanying essay, and I find that essay really interesting. So why are Smith and Wootton Major and that essay important to understanding Tolkien's vision of faery in particular?
I think because they give us a picture of faery which is, first of all, it's a process of Tolkien's thought throughout his life.
Mm-hmm.
And in some ways, it kind of sums up and recapitulates, it culminates what we see in the rest of his work. So I think from that perspective, Smith of Wootton Major and the essay really are very valuable for adding to our understanding of Tolkien's vision of faery. And I did not see a lot of scholarship on it, on Tolkien's vision of faery in in Smith of Wootton Major and the essay. So it occurred to me that this would be an area where some work could be done that would add to the scholarship and also add to people's understanding of Tolkien's vision of faery.
Okay, thank you. Now, there's a question in the Q&A actually that would make a marvelous follow-up question to this, so I'm going to ask it right now. Serena asks, how would you say Tolkien's view of faery compares to that of other authors? Was it idiosyncratic? Do you think it's more medieval, more modern, or something else?
That's a really good question, and I have to say that I don't actually know a lot about how other authors really talk about faery to a great extent. Faery, generally speaking, in folklore, faery is seen as something at best indifferent, at worst malicious, often mischievous. So I think that Tolkien's view of faery as being beneficent, as being positive towards humanity, is definitely at odds with the folklore view. And I think it may be at odds also with the medieval view of faery as being something very much other, very much aloof. When it interacts with us, it's usually not in a positive way. And I say that with very little knowledge of faery in the medieval way of thinking. It's definitely something I'd like to look into more, but I tend to think that Tolkien is doing something different when he's portraying the elves and faery as being positive towards humanity. I tend to think that might be idiosyncratic about his vision of faery.
It often makes me think about that sense of awe and anxiety, I suppose, as well, towards Lothlorien that we find in The Lord of the Rings, when you have this combination of the sublime and the beautiful in Galadriel, and Lothlorien that is seen as a perilous realm. But it's pointed out that folks take their peril in with them, that the peril is what you make of it in some ways. And of course, once the Fellowship enter Lothlorien, they find it's actually much more welcoming than perhaps the folks of Rohan would have thought it would be, right?
Yeah, and I think that's something that is very Tolkienian, but I'm not sure how common that is outside of Tolkien. It's a vast area where I need to become more familiar with the.
Okay. So before I come to any more of the Q&A questions that are sitting there, and there's still a few, let's focus on the work that you did towards this project. All right. Was there anything that you came across that surprised you while you were doing your research?
I think the extent to which Tolkien presents faery as being positive towards humanity, that really surprised me. And I guess what also surprised me is that Tolkien talks about enchantment in a number of other places, but he doesn't really use that word very often in Smith of Wootton Major or the essay. So I'm wondering whether he had maybe moved away from thinking about enchantment when he's thinking about faery. So that was one thought that I had that kind of surprised me a little bit.
Okay. Well, I have another question from the Q&A that I think will make a wonderful follow-up question to this, because we've been talking about faery, what it meant to Tolkien, etc. Jonathan asks, you mentioned psychology in the implications, and he wonders if we can see Tolkien as prescribing faery as a treatment for mental health problems.
Oh, absolutely. I think that the Smith the Wootton Major, and in all of Tolkien's work, to be honest, is very. It's something that you go into and you come out feeling better and more whole. Um, so I absolutely think that you could use Smith the Wootton Major and Tolkien's work in general for bibliotherapy, so to speak. There's something very wholesome about them that when you go in, it's possible to come out better than when you came. When you come out better than when you came in. So, and I would even see the possibility of a guided tour, sort of a book club, um, working its way through Lord of the Rings, working its way through Smith of Wootton Major, that might be of use, might be of help to those who are going through mental illness. So yeah, I think there's a lot of possibilities there.
I love that word bibliotherapy. I completely buy into that idea of bibliotherapy.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, so another follow-up question. This is from Brenton. He asks, why do we age out of faery, the place? Why do we get too old for it? Faery is not as perilous to children, but in the stories they fade away, are exiled, or fall from faery. Is that in Tolkien anywhere that you've seen? What's happening? He asks.
It's kind of interesting. And then Smith of Wootton Major, Smith does have to give up the star. When he gets to a certain point of his life, he does have to give up the star and pass it on to the next person to get it and to benefit from it. So I'm not sure why this, at this point in our culture, I'm not sure why we look down upon faery and sort of ascribe it as being something that children are interested in. I think there's some unfortunate associations with the name that a lot of folks have difficulty with. And I think there's just an overall modern tendency, a modern way of thinking that, all these fantasy and fairy stories, they're great for kids, but you have to grow out of them at some point and accept the harshness of reality. And I think, probably everybody who's listening and everybody who's associated with Signum and so forth, definitely sees things very differently than that. So I think some folks age out of it, so to speak, but I think there are plenty of those who are Rebel Alliance, whatever you want to call it, who are very much, interested in continuing association with faery.
Yeah, it's got that unfortunate sort of connection with fairy stories, which of course Tolkien makes the point in On Fairy Stories that they're not just for children, that yes, they're for children, but they're also for grown-ups. And when you connect that kind of fairy story, Fairy, with fairy, if you're putting those two together and conflating them, then you're, I think, infantilizing the concept rather than understanding that it is something greater than that, right?
I think there's a quote by C.S. Lewis. I'm going to butcher it, but basically the idea that he's getting across is that when we grow up, we grow out of the idea that we should be grown up and behave like a grown up. The point I think he's making is that, when we become adults, when we become truly mature, we no longer look at those things as being only for the immature. We're mature enough to see that even quote unquote immature things can be important to us. So
yes, yeah.
Somebody who knows that quote can post it. It'd be nice.
Yes. Oh yes, there's a comment from Cecilia who says, Trevor, are you volunteering to host this book club?
I'll add it to my queue of things to
yeah, who needs spare time? We have a couple more really interesting questions for you, so I will ask you some of these. Sharon asks, by the standards of this essay and the example of Smith of Wootton Major, the elves of Middle-earth aren't quite so aligned with the description of faery. In fact, the elves of Middle-earth are far more human-like than fairy-like. Middle-earth is not in the scope of your thesis, she acknowledges, but did you consider this conundrum?
Yes, and that was kind of an important thing to think about, is what is the relationship between the elves of Middle Earth, that we get in Lord of the Rings and Hobbit and Silmarillion. What is the relationship between those and the elves and fairies of Smith of Wootton Major? And I don't think there's actually a whole lot of direct connection between the two of them, but I think that they are both examples of what Tolkien was trying to communicate about faery. The elves in Arda are very human-like, but I think there's enough there that makes them distinct enough from humans and more like the fairies and elves in Smith of Wootton Major. That last point's debatable a little bit one way or the other, but I think both of them, the point I'm trying to get at is that both of them really are talking about and connected to Tolkien's idea of faery.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, as Sharon's just pointed out in the chat, Feanor blows the curve on that one.
Yeah, and Feanor is
he's Feanor, right? It's just Feanor. Okay.
Yep.
There's a comment by Chris Swank who says, I think that quote on the lack of faery or enchantment leading to desires for money and domination, however that went, is a reason some supposed grown-ups don't like fantasy. They prefer the money and domination. What do you think?
I think that's a really, really powerful point. And I think one of the things, if you want to talk about the prophetic, I think one of the things that Tolkien, as well as all of us who are in tune with faery, one of the things that we can do is provide a corrective or an alternative to this kind of attitude of focusing on possession and control and money and so forth. I think that's one of the value adds that we provide to society is, hey, there's this other thing over there that Tolkien represented and other people wrote about, which is an alternative to that and perhaps a better, more wholesome, more fruitful alternative. So, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Okay, and Sharon has another question for you. She says, I see a parallel between Tolkien's structure of Smith and Le Guin's description of a carrier bag being the primary means of sharing culture. We use a container to collect and bring back important things to share with others. Tolkien seems to say that going and coming from faery yields this same effect. Can you comment on what Tolkien brings to us by using this structure?
Tolkien brings to us the result of a lifetime of thinking about a lot of things which provide us with a they provide us with food, with I'm going to go ahead and say it, they provide us with spiritual food, and by spiritual, I don't necessarily mean religious, I just mean in terms of what nourishes our spirit. So when we go to Tolkien and other writers, I'm not saying it's just Tolkien, but I think there are other writers as well, we get that food from them that nourishes us. And so I think that's part of the answer to your question.
Okay. By the way, Sharon says that last question was probably by Carrie Gross because she's using a link that Sharon gave her.
Oh, okay.
Knowledge it's Carrie's question. Okay. So back to your process of writing your thesis. You mentioned at the end of your presentation that there was a whole bunch of stuff that you wanted to include in your thesis, but you had to leave it out for time, etc., etc. If you had to pick one aspect that you wanted to pursue but you couldn't, what would be the one darling you had to kill?
Enchantment. Mm-hmm. In the process of writing this, I really became very much in tune with the idea that enchantment is important. We need enchantment. Tolkien, despite actually not mentioning it a whole lot of times, is very much a conduit, maybe that's not the best word, but a conduit to us of enchantment, and that enchantment is something we very much need in our lives to Tolkien says necessary for the health and complete functioning of the human. Mm-hmm. So I think enchantment is a big part of that. Yeah, good question.
So that was left out simply for time, for space, etc.
I could have written a lot more on it, and I actually had a couple thousand words on it, and I just cut it because, like you said, you have to kill your darlings. So.
Yeah. But it's never wasted, right? Because if you decide you're going to take this study further, then it's there for you, isn't it?
Yeah, and that's one of the really interesting things about this process is that it's not complete. It opens up lots of other things, and I found the process for many reasons valuable. But that was one of them. Is that there's now 5, 6, 7, 8 things that I can expand into and perhaps write, other articles, so forth, so forth. So
Mm.
yeah.
In fact, that's what Chris Swank is saying. She's saying, so now you can put it in an article and publish it. No pressure, but TikTok.
um, yeah, yeah, absolutely.
In all that spare time that you have. No, I mean, we would definitely encourage you to take this work and push it further. And Sharon says your thesis is a good fit for MythMoot this year.
Thank you.
Just saying. Just saying.
Hadn't quite thought that far ahead, but we'll see.
Okay, so one of the things that I want to ask you, because you've come through a really strenuous process. I think we can agree that the thesis process is not easy, that you have to put a lot of yourself into this, and it's a lot of hard work. There are a number of students who are coming up to their thesis now, and I wonder if you have any advice for them. Something that, perhaps you would have loved to have known before you started yourself, or something that you just think is the best piece of advice you've been given.
I think the main piece of advice that I can give anybody, and this applies to almost anything that you do of a creative kind, is pick something that you absolutely love. And if you do, it'll still seem like work at times, because even fun stuff can be work at times, but there'll be something pulling you along, something pulling or pushing you at all times to proceed with it. And I think that can be extraordinarily valuable, because you may come to a time where you've had it, you're burnt out, you look at everything you've written and you hate it. But if you can at least love the topic that you're into, then that can carry you through those dark times, or however you want to put it.
Mm-hmm. There's a number of comments and questions here that are really, if I summarize them all, are asking, what's next for Trevor Brierly?
Oh my goodness. I really am, the more I think about it, I am very interested in expanding this. I put a lot of work into it. It's had some exposure. I think that with some rework, what I have right now could be, published. But I'd also like to, having kind of gotten this started, I'd like to look into those other things that were on that last slide, and expand out into those, because I think there's something very valuable about what we're talking about here. Tolkien says that it's necessary for the health and complete functioning. Well, if that's true, then I think there's definitely some value in taking these ideas and other ideas and making them more publicly available. So that's a very distinct possibility. And I do like the idea of a bibliotherapy with Lord of the Rings, but I think I'd have to probably get some training and credentials before I could do something like that, other than a friend to friend basis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, all sounds good. So, PhD?
Oh goodness, probably not. I have a very long queue of things that I've wanted to do after the thesis, and probably not a PhD.
Hey, never say never, but I think you're entitled to a break.
Thank you. I think a PhD does open a lot of doors for you that might be valuable.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Okay, well, there are no more questions, but It is now incumbent upon me to inform you, Trevor Brierly, that that was magnificent. That was
Oh,
great. That
thank
was
you.
wonderful. And
Thank
of
you.
course, you've not just passed, you passed with honours.
Oh,
It's
thank
an
you.
absolutely marvelous piece of work. And, you know, I hope that you are proud of what you have achieved, because you should be. It really is a fabulous piece of work and an important piece of work. So it's been an absolute privilege to work with you over the last few months and help you see this through. So,
Thank you. Thank you for all of your help.
well, it was fantastic. Lots of congratulations coming through. Um, yeah, Brenton says, I really wish I had that short talk 25 years ago when he was 5 years old. Ah, sure.
Sure.
But he says, very cool. Thanks. I love hearing an honors paper talk like this.
Oh,
Yeah.
thank you.
Sharon says, your advisor is very proud.
Oh,
Everyone is very,
thank you, Sharon.
yeah, absolutely wonderful. So, thank you very much. And you obviously will be graduating this summer at Mythmoot. So that's absolutely wonderful. But of course, your Signum journey does not have to end here. And we hope that you'll pop back and do some other stuff within the program somewhere anyway, apart from all the, you know, the stuff you do for Signum anyway. But learning journeys don't have to end at a certificate, do they?
No. No, and that's one of the things I really love about Signum is that there's so many other opportunities for learning and teaching. So
Mm-hmm.
it's a real blessing.
Yes, they're saying you're not going anywhere. Okay, so thank you very much to everybody who came along to support Trevor today. Thank you to those who also posted questions that made this thesis theatre go swimmingly. Thank you to Trevor for all of his hard work. Thank you to Verlin Flieger for stepping in as second reader and helping out there. And I hope you have enjoyed this thesis theatre as much as I have. So thank you very much, everybody. Bye.